with you. You know, people sort of talk about what's important, what's not important. We throw a lot of data around, but I want you to know that people are interested in the spiritual questions that people are asking. Now, I'm about to go through a presentation rather quickly, and I'll cover a lot of ground in a short amount of time. But I want to let you know, I want to both let you know where to get this information, but also illustrate the point that people are interested. So right now, this is on Christianity Today. We just released this moments ago, and it's on Christianity Today. It's on Religion News Service. Christianity Today, by the way, one of our partners. You can get more information about them in the hallway. It'll be in Outreach Magazine, the column I'm writing for Outreach Magazine. But right now, it's on the pages of Religion News Service, which goes to hundreds of your local newspapers, and Christianity Today, and references what we're doing here today. Why? Because people are asking questions about the questions people are asking. People are asking questions about the time that we live in. And one of the things that we're seeing, even here thus far, is we're seeing some themes sort of develop in our conversations today. Listen for those themes as we go throughout Amplify. For example, several people have already mentioned groups for non-believers in one form or another. Lee mentioned what Gary Poole was doing. We could talk about things like Alpha, Christianity Explored. You mentioned Q Place or My Hope. So what we're finding is that people are making a dangerous decision to follow Christ, dangerous in their mind, in safe places. And so we're beginning to see that theme somewhat emerge. One of the things we're seeing, and we'll continue to see, we've seen a couple people mention that you need a person, a key person who's helping to remind us of the import of evangelism in the local church. Several people mentioned already. I actually recently had the privilege of reading a doctoral dissertation by one of our speakers, Rice Brooks, who talks about, as he studied the role of the evangelist in a local church, not necessarily the traveling evangelist, though we began with one of the most famous in the world, Luis Palau, but that local church person who's provoking to love and good deeds, who's leading that Ephesians 4 ministry of an evangelist. Alan Hirsch will be sharing more about this as well. You don't want to miss Kim Reisman when she talks about how to help people take their next steps. And so we're beginning to see themes emerge. We're seeing themes like pastors and church leaders, and how that church leader, how he or she is key to setting an evangelistic temperature, an evangelistic tone in the life of the church. And so we're going to be building on those themes. Part of what we're doing with Amplify and with the Billy Graham Center here is we're building a community that'll discuss some of these themes. And I hope you heard, you just heard a minute ago from someone from InterVarsity, and we've heard about centers in Houston, and we'll hear about what Pentecostal churches are doing, and what Methodist churches are doing, and what Baptists are doing. Why? Because we're trying to build a community where we can learn from one another. Matter of fact, I mentioned a few minutes ago the denominational leaders meeting. Some of you come up to me and ask, well, can I come? And if you're a denomination leader, if you're a organization leader, or you're a network leader, and your role is in the area of evangelism, it's not just a local church role, but some sort of movemental role. We're going to meet over at Barrows Auditorium at 6 o'clock. You can come and visit with us. We'll share a little bit about a fellowship we're calling, a national evangelism leadership coalition of sorts. And so these are things we're trying to build team because of this moment we're in. We believe that we're in a moment when God's people need to pull together to show and share the love of Jesus to a broken and a hurting world. Now, what I want you to see is that these pathways we will walk are not new pathways. James just talked a minute ago about how there's often sometimes cyclical generational realities. Jeremiah chapter 6 verse 16 says, "This is what the Lord says, stand by the roadways and look. Ask about the ancient paths, which is the way that is good. Take it and find rest for yourselves." Now this passage is referencing specifically the prophet Jeremiah calling out the Israelites to take the ancient path, the path of Yahweh, and to find rest there. But we think that one of the paths we need to learn to walk again as Christians is the path of showing and sharing the love of Jesus in the midst of this broken and hurting world. Well, when about a year ago, the Billy Graham Center partnered together with LifeWay Research. I know it's a little strange. Right now, I lead the LifeWay Research. Scott McConnell will serve in that role in about 5 days, and I will be leading the Billy Graham Center as executive director. We're hiring a managing director, but a year ago that wasn't the case, and so we've sort of switched some roles here. But at LifeWay Research, we've been working with the Billy Graham Center on a groundbreaking study that examines the current state of evangelism, specifically focused on the U.S. Now, don't misunderstand. We're going to have a global focus at the Billy Graham Center, but this study was specifically focused on the U.S. Now, here's the methodology. Okay, take a look. Exciting. All right, let's go to the next slide. But it's It's kind of a law that I got to tell you the methodology, but this you can find all online if you go to Christianity Today, Religion News Service, and ultimately to the LifeWay Research homepage. But we're looking at unchurched people, adults, who have not attended a religious service in the past 6 months, except for a religious holiday or a special event like a wedding or a funeral. So this data out today, I can't lay it all out for you. Rick Richardson, who you'll meet along with the team there, will share some of the data. But what and he'll be writing more about this, but the reality is I'm going to focus on a couple of things and give us some new data that I think will be helpful, right? I want to give us data about the need to reduce some inhibitions among God's people. I think that we're talking ourselves out of evangelizing an entire generation, thinking that they're angry at us and they won't listen to us. Now, the reality is that there are some ways that are not received well. That's not a secret. But it seems that many in the church are terrified. My 17-year-old daughter, I have 3 daughters. I have an 11-year-old, a 14-year-old, and a 17-year-old. And they all occasionally come upon a slang word that becomes a focal word in our house for a while. And today the word that my daughter is using all the time, Kristen, my 17-year-old, about to be a student here at Wheaton in the fall, the word she uses all the time is terrifying. She says, she's watching something on television, a political commercial comes to mind, and she says, "Oh, that's terrifying." She did point out to me, she said, "This is my first election, Dad. This is the first election I get to vote in. Can you explain this to me?" I said, "Honey, I can't. It's terrifying." But my daughter, that's her word, is terrifying, right? Her word is terrifying right now. And terrifying is an interesting thing because when you actually, a survey, American 3 greatest fears, according to the Chapman University survey, their 3 greatest fears are public speaking, heights, and bugs, snakes or other animals. So the lesson here is always do your evangelism training in private, in low-lying areas away from wildlife. No, that's not what it is. But the reality is a lot of people, this is terrifying. Passages like Romans 10, 14, and 15 are terrifying to them. But how then, right? So how then can they call upon him whom they have not believed in? How can they believe without hearing about him? How can they hear without a preacher? And when they hear the word preacher, and I love what Luis Palau exhorted us to see that as a proclaimer, not simply that person who would open a Bible and preach at a meeting, says, how can they preach unless they are sent, right? There's that missional turn that we need so much to say, as Isaiah did, encountering the holiness of God, "Here I am, Lord, send me." And it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who announce the gospel of good news. Now, the reality is that we live in a time when a lot of Christians have heard that a lot of non-Christians don't like them. Now, I want you to know there's a difference between what people think about the Christians when compared to what they think about their neighbor who's a Christian. Okay, this is an important statistical distinction. People will say, I don't like a group of people, but they like the individuals that they know. I did a research project a few years ago. I was asked to be on CNN, and they said, I want you to come on CNN Live at about 5 o'clock. And I was a little, needless to say, nervous. This is not something I normally do, but they want to talk about some data. And one of the things they want to talk about was some negative perceptions of Christians. And one of the questions that the anchor really zeroed in on in the live interview was the fact that 44% of Americans say sometimes Christians get on my nerves. Well, I've been a pastor for a long time, and that's about the percentage of my experience as well. About 44% of Christians sometimes get on my nerves. But the reality is when you talk about individuals, neighbors, friends, and coworkers, and family members, well, let's actually take a look. So instead of opining or instead of panicking or being terrified, we actually asked unchurched people. You can see the methodology, but let me show you some of their answers. In research, we tend to collapse the strongly agree and the somewhat agree into one answer, and we collapse the somewhat disagree and the disagree into another. And when we do that, let's take a look. First of all, my Christian friends talk about their faith too much. I want you to miss this. Overwhelmingly, people disagree. I see so many of you taking pictures. Did I give you permission to take pictures? Put that camera down. Why are you going to put a dirty picture on the internet like this? Why don't you just download the research project and use it in your ministry? Amen? All right. Take all the pictures you want. I'm just kidding. My Christian friends talk about their faith too much. People don't think that. Matter of fact, take a look at this. If a friend of mine really values their faith, I don't mind them talking about it. 79%, 8 out of 10 say, I don't mind. Now here's the deal. 18% don't, they don't want you to talk about your faith. And I get that, and you will encounter that. Those moments will happen. I've had them happen in my own life, right? One of the things I've tried to do is to share the gospel with my neighbors. A few years ago, we actually drew a little map of the 8 people who live within 2 houses of our home, and we individually sought to share the gospel with each of them. You've heard this theme from several of the speakers about how leaders need to lead. I believe you can't lead what you won't live, and if I'm going to go around and encourage people to share the gospel, I need to be sharing the gospel. So I've had the privilege of sharing the gospel with 7 of 8 of them, not inviting them to church, not having them over for dinner, doing all of those things, but ultimately sharing the gospel with 7 of 8 of them. You say, why not 8 of 8 of them? Because one of them doesn't like us. They don't want to hear it, okay? So there's going to be those rejections. Now, let's take we dug a little deeper, right? When someone wants to talk about their religious beliefs, how do you respond? Well, 47% says, I discuss it freely. Yeah, 31% say, I listen without actively participating. I think Lee shared a little bit of that in the front of a Cracker Barrel. I discuss it with some discomfort. I change the subject as soon as possible. Now, here's where it gets interesting, right? Let's take a look at the next slide. Has a Christian ever shared with you one-on-one the benefits of being a Christian? This is deeply disturbing, my friends. 65% say they know or not sure that someone has actually shared or how to become a Christian. 71%, 7 out of 10 say no or not sure that anyone has ever shared with them how a person becomes a Christian. Now, when we see numbers like this, it does remind us that we live in an age that we are talking ourselves out of the last words of Jesus being our first priority. If someone you knew invited you to the following activities sponsored by a local Christian church, how likely would you be to attend? Now, I hear these numbers quoted pretty regularly. I hear it sometimes my research quoted in ways that just unimaginably so. And it appears that 87% of statistics are made up on the spot. But when we look at the numbers, a couple of things we need to factor in. For example, here, unchurched people, 5% say they're extremely likely to attend if you were to invite me. 29% do a worship service. 29% said they're likely to attend. 37% say unlikely, and 29% say extremely likely. Now, you may have heard sometimes people say, well, this high percentage says they would go to your church. Well, a lot of times that's the sample as the whole. We're looking at unchurched people. So your Christian neighbors who love Jesus and go to a Lutheran church might go to your Pentecostal church if you invited them, right? And praise God, you can visit, you can be friends. But the reality is it gets a little harder when we're talking about unchurched people. Now, does that mean that 5% who are extremely likely are going to attend? No, it doesn't mean that. And here's why it doesn't mean that. Because in research, we have a couple of things going on. One's called the halo effect, right? It's a technical term that describes how people answer surveys. And they answer surveys in a way that they determine is socially desirable. And another word to put that is they lie to look good. Okay? That's what we experience when we call pastors and ask them the attendance of their church last week. We round up to the nearest 1,000 in some cases, or 100. But the reality is there's a significant openness, and if you look among unchurched, extremely likely, add those up, you get about 35%. That's more than a third. Say they're extremely or likely to attend unchurched people, if somebody would invite them. If someone you knew invited you to the following activities sponsored by a local Christian church, notice how the numbers go up when the service goes out. The numbers go up when the service goes out. Now we have 14% say they're extremely likely if there's an event my church is putting on to make our neighborhood safer, to 47% saying likely, to the point now we're actually over a strong majority. Community service project is a majority of people. Sports or exercise program is 46%. So the reality is that sometimes we talk about in church there are front doors to the church, but many of these are side doors, opportunities for gospel impact. Now, the reality is, I think one of the reasons that we have sort of decreased our evangelistic activity is because maybe we have grown a little bit weary of our evangelistic methodologies. Now, for many of us who write in, my field is missiology. I have a PhD in missiology. We have challenged over the last few years maybe some of the assumptions of Christendom, maybe some of the assumptions where we had this home field advantage. We've called the church to be on mission. We've called Christians to live in missionary-like ways. We've called them to not simply be reductionistic, transactional conversionists. And I think that's a good thing. But as the pendulum has swung, I think that for many, and I believe for too many, they have become more comfortable mocking evangelistic methodologies than actually doing evangelism. And I think that's problematic at best and just downright bad for our souls and for the proclamation of the gospel. There's a very famous line that many of you will be familiar. Someone once asked D.L. Moody about his methods for evangelism, attempting to win people to the Lord. Moody's reply was, I like my way of doing it better than your way of not doing it. Now here's the deal. I don't know that God has called you to do this approach or that approach. And one of the things we want to set a broad table here at Amplify and ongoing from the Billy Graham Center. But I want to say to you, and I want you to see and to hear, that the answer to our evangelistic angst is not to say everyone else is doing it wrong, but I don't have a way. I just want to criticize your way. Now, of course, it's a bit of preaching to the choir here, but we all represent movements where this is ultimately a challenging reality. So are people open? Are people seeking God or not? Now, I recognize whenever you ask that question, some of you immediately go to Romans. There are none who seek God. No one. I want to thank the Calvinists. I know. And then, of course, the response is, if you seek me, you'll find me with all my heart. And I'd like to thank the Arminians. Here's the deal. I'm not making a theological moment here, but I am making a statistical moment, right? I can't settle all the theological opportunities and challenges, but I can do math. Let's take a look at some of the math. A major priority in my life, most people say, is finding a deeper purpose. That doesn't mean they're looking for a deeper purpose in God, but for a majority, they say finding a deeper purpose. Now, here's a question we might reword. Let's take a look at this question. Many of you will be familiar with it. It's been the standard evangelical pickup line for about 50 years. It goes something like this. Hey, if you were to die today, do you know for sure you go to heaven or hell? Or heaven in this case. And actually what's interesting is a few things, right? Take a look at the numbers. I asked this question 10 years ago, re-asked this question. This is the question that Religion News Service is focused on in their story that released just a few minutes ago. But a couple of things. 43% of people never wonder, if I were to die today, do I go to heaven? Now, I want you to know, that would be among them would be, I don't come from a Christian family, right? I grew up in a nominally Catholic home outside of New York City. My father would not self-identify as a believing Christian today. And so, as a matter of fact, the first person I ever witnessed to was to my father as a new believer. I went and shared the gospel with my father. I still am doing so decades later. He never is wondering if he were to die today, whether or not he'd go to heaven. He's quite sure everyone goes to heaven except Hitler, Stalin, and his third grade math teacher, but everyone else is there. But I do want you to also notice, John Sorensen and I talked a little bit about this. John's the wonderful leader of Evangelism Explosion, which has blessed many of us. As he pointed out, you do get that 10% of people are wondering every day, if they were to die today, do they know for sure they go to heaven? And weekly, it's 8%. And when you add those all up together, you can get to a third are asking that question pretty regularly. We ask them questions about, now the Christian life is not solely about our eternal destiny. It's about living here, a life that's changed and a life that becomes a change agent. But we ask them some questions like this. Which of the following statements is closest to your own beliefs on what happens after you die? About 37% of the unchurched, it's not all Americans, but the unchurched say no one knows. 17% say they go to heaven because they've trusted Jesus as Savior and Lord. 15% say you will go to heaven because you've done your best. 12% say nothing will happen. 7% say another life form. They're great folks to party with. And 5% say you'll go to heaven because God loves all people. And 3% say you go to heaven because you kept the 10 Commandments. Now listen here. The data indicates that in many cases, unchurched Americans are becoming harder soil. When we look at these numbers just about 10 years ago, the numbers, now it's not a direct comparison because the methodologies were different, but it's about 20% of people wondering every day whether or not if they died, they'd go to heaven when they die. So what do we do? How do we have unchurched conversations? What are we to do with this reality? The old approach might be to assume people are Christians. I remember when I came home to share the gospel with my father, I came to Christ at a youth camp of my Episcopal church. My mother forced me to go in the midst of the charismatic renewal. I sat in the back row in this Camp Wingman, and down in basically the Everglades of Florida. I heard the gospel there. I went home that day. I knew my mother was a Christian. She made me go. I knew my father was not. I heard the words that I heard the speaker say, so I went home to my father and said, "Dad, are you saved?" And he said to me, "Saved from what?" I said, "I don't know, but you need to be." And now, again, just that language assumes so much. I mean, I could say now, well, saved from the reality of sin, the punishment that comes from unforgiven sin and the wages of sin. But the reality is there were 15 assumptions that my father did not share with me that I could not therefore communicate. Now, mind you, I was just a young man. So over time, I've tried to share more effectively over the years. But what does it look about? Now, the new approach is maybe to ask about faith, ask about their faith. Romans 15, 20 and 21, Paul says, "My aim is to evangelize where Christ has not been named." There's an increasing number of people who nobody has shared the gospel with in our culture, and you get to live out the Pauline ambition to share the gospel with someone who's not heard it before. I mean, they say they've not heard it before. Now, don't misunderstand. I want to push people to global missions. I want to push people to the 1040 window. We'll be doing a lot of that at the Billy Graham Center. The first place we ought to consider where to plant a church and preach the gospel is among a people group that has never heard the gospel, and there are just now under 3,000 unengaged, unreached people groups around the world. But I'm kind of stunned that the opportunity is here before us. It'll require a commitment for us to share. Now, mind you, Paul said in 1 Corinthians 2:2, he said, I didn't think it was a good idea to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified, and that's what the world needs to hear today. To do that, community matters. Our numbers, our statistics point to us to a reality. When we looked at the data, we found that a commitment to a local church of some sort was an incredibly important factor in evangelism success and long-term Christian commitment. When Rick and Beth and Lon share with you tomorrow about what they're doing through the Evangelism Initiative, you'll hear these things. Let's take a look at some of the numbers related to the unchurched and their view. We asked, have you ever regularly attended a Christian church? 62% said yes as a child. Now, statistically, there's no way that 62% of all the unchurched people attended church as a child, but their perception is that they did. Some say as a teen, some say as an adult. But the reality is, we look to the future. How likely are you to attend regularly sometime in the future? 33% say, I'm likely. But the vast majority say that they're actually not. We asked them what their religious preference is. It's interesting that among all Americans, the most common religious preference is actually Protestant. It holds the plurality, Christian Protestant. But the unchurched, the numbers are just a little bit different. Most unchurched people, though, are at least marginally Christian in affinity. The largest group of people to be evangelized in our society are nominal Christians. Christians who identify themselves, people who identify themselves as Christians, but it doesn't necessarily have a meaningful component in their life. That's the largest and the fastest shrinking group at the same time. That's about 45 to 50% of the population today, using some numbers I did. If you're interested, Google an article I wrote in USA Today on convictional, congregational, and cultural Christians. But so about 45 to 50% are nominal Christians, but the fastest growing category is actually secular people, and in the college students, a third of them are avowedly secular. We asked them, which describes your current faith, right? Some say, I consider myself a Christian, but I'm not particularly devout. I consider myself a Christian, but I'm not currently practicing. I consider myself a Christian with a strong faith. People have done some research recently on unchurched devout Christians. It's kind of a sad reality, often birthed by hurt. And I want to encourage people to see the church as a partner in this gospel proclamation. But the other question is, has a Christian ever shared with you one-on-one the benefits of participating in a local church? Those numbers are pretty much similar. People aren't sharing the gospel, and they're not sharing about Jesus, they're not sharing about the church. Either you say, well, do both of those matter? Yeah, they do. You can't love Jesus and put aside his wife. The church is the bride of Christ. So the reality is there are a few things in which the church can be more countercultural in the way it practices community. This is a missional opportunity for us. The church can manifest its missional nature and bring about real gospel changes. Communities live on mission. One of the more fascinating stories is by the name of Augustine of Canterbury. Augustine of Canterbury takes a band of traveling Christians who go and settle outside of a town out in what would now be England, and just they themselves were a community that modeled the gospel. And as they modeled the gospel, they began to engage others who were open to considering the claims of the gospel. And as we live in the time where we find ourselves, as Christians will band together in churches and community and missional communities seeking to show and share the love of Jesus in their neighborhood, lives can be changed. I got a text a few minutes ago from my neighbors, some of whom I've had the privilege of leading to Christ and baptizing, one of whom now serves as a deacon in our church, and another couple I baptized are now missionaries in Brazil, just from our neighbors. And the random one said, let's do something together before you leave. I'm moving in just a few days. And we're doing so. Why? Because we're friends. They weren't prospects, they were friends. And what would I do with my friends other than tell them about the person who changed everything in my life and can change everything in theirs? Sisters and brothers, we need an evangelism revolution this time and this moment. And I want to give you some statistics that I hope and pray will help you to consider those realities. But ultimately, that revolution has to happen in our hearts. I want to give us the opportunity to respond to that. The band's going to come up at this time. I want to give us the opportunity to respond to that reality, because here's the deal. It's not going to get easier. It's going to get harder. But I don't want us to talk ourselves out of showing and sharing the love of Jesus to a generation that when we ask them, not when we make assumptions about them, not when we say they don't like us. Listen, they might have negative perception about this group they've heard of called Christians, but they know their neighbors, they know their coworkers, they know their friends. And if we will be those who are changed by the power of the gospel, Paul writes in 2 Corinthians that we would be reconciled, to be agents of reconciliation. And if we would live in such a way and help our churches live in such a way that Christ is enough, that changes everything. I mentioned that I came to Christ in the back of that camp, and they played a song that day. I remember it quite distinctly on August 13th. The end of the message, I was sitting in the back row, and at the end of the message, they began to play a song, and in it says, "Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will go strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace." Christ is enough. As we look to this moment we are in, may we not just hear, because you're here because you're passionate about these things, but will we pay the price? Will we live on mission in such a way? Will we rally God's people to such a cause that they might show and share the love of Jesus in this time and in this cultural moment where society's open if people will just share? Christ is enough.